varieties of health education topics, specifically trying to find people that specialize in something and want to share it with the community, allow people to ask questions and poke curiosities. Hello. So today, for our second Mindful Moments, we have Nick Denton. He's a graduate from Northern Michigan University's Medicinal Plant Chemistry program. He is here to talk about plant medicine, of course, and at the end, when he's all done, throughout the process, feel free to ask questions, poke his brain. It's kind of the point of these Mindful Moments, is to try and get some open dialogue going and let curiosity roam. When the event comes to an end, at the back table we have some stickers with our logo on it. Feel free to take those are free. If you feel so inclined to drop a donation in the bin, there's a donation bin back there. And then there's also a few medicinal plant books to poke through, and feel free to conversate. We have to clear the room by 8 o'clock, but I think we'll have plenty of time. So, but with that, I'm gonna leave it to Nick.
Cool.
Thanks, Nick.
You're welcome. Thank you for the introduction, Kate, and thank you for hosting the event too. My name is Nicholas Denton. You can just call me Nick. I went to NMU for medicinal plant chemistry because I was starting a business in plant medicine providing. I don't know what to call it exactly, an apothecary, a pharmacy, or just making medicinal plants, because over time I was just learning about the world and science and chemistry, and just kind of came into finding plants as like a use. They have uses for everything. It's like where we get all of our drugs, it's where we get all of our medicines, where we get so many different fibers. They say if it's not mined, it's grown. So everything that's not a metal, everything that's not solid, is something that's coming straight out of the earth. And so I just found that I needed to kind of give that information to anybody who will listen. So like that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, is just me telling you everything I think I know all at once. And so I had like a bunch of my own knowledge that I was just kind of putting together, and then school really like rounded out a lot of the edges and like filled me in all these different gaps where I was just trying to figure out like how this stuff really works, where it comes from, what its like professional applications are. But by all means, this is like kind of my own thing. It's not so much like, don't take me as a representative of like the school or the program or anything, because a lot of the information comes from there, but a lot of it is just from my own kind of putting things together. So I just kind of want to make that like little disclosure before we get started. But basically, I wanted to put forth a couple objectives here just so that we can kind of get an overview of what I'm going to go through. It's basically like 25 or 26 slides or something. Really want to tell you about where various world plant medicine traditions have come from, the difference between what we have in the Western world, which is considered allopathy or Western medicine, and then how that separates from the various traditions of the world, and how they kind of developed tandemly or together out from each other. And with that, there's going to be like a little bit of topic about drug medicines, allopathic medicines versus synergetic plant medicines. We'll talk more when we get there. It gets a little confusing, but hopefully I can clear it all up and like paint a good picture of what really medicine is, how it works in plants, and how it works in the pharmaceutical industry. Then I want to talk about dietetics, which is basically nutrition and diet-based medicine, which you could consider a plant medicine, as the old Hippocratic Oath, or Hippocrates, not sure how to pronounce his name, goes, let food be your medicine. And so I'm going to like try to explain why that is actually such a powerful axiom to live by, because truly all medicine basically comes from the essential building blocks of matter, which are found in foodstuffs, which doesn't exclude plants, or doesn't exclude animals, but it's definitely present in both plants and animals. So then I'm going to talk about like how to use plant medicine, which isn't as complicated as you might think, and then how to find plant medicine recipes, and then some bonus content at the very end to talk about shamanic traditions and psychedelic medicines and how they've been used in history and what the guys are saying nowadays in the industry. So when did it all start? It's basically, in my mind, very intimately intertwined with the origins of civilization and it has been present since the inception of writing, and you could say just epistemology in general. Once civilization started, we have been constantly making plant medicines through various different means, and the information on how to use them comes from, I think, a lot of the world's holy literature or the Genesis stories. Like, for example, the ancient Mesopotamians, which are arguably one of the oldest civilizations on the planet, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's a flood myth, and Gilgamesh is tasked with understanding his mortality, and he's obviously like rallying against it. He says, I'm going to go find immortality, I'm going to cure this aging, this disease. And so a large part of the story is him looking for this like hawthorn bush, this thorny bush that you can only find on the ocean floor. And so like his friends like tie weights to his hands and stuff and stick him down in the bottom of the ocean so he can find this plant, which they call in the book the plant that makes old men young again. So it's something that they thought would keep you perpetually young and rejuvenate your health and basically make you immortal. And that is a very common theme across many of the world's religions or plant medicine traditions. You find it in like Hinduism and Zoroastrianism. You got this plant concoction called ambrosia, which is supposed to give you godlike powers, godlike knowledge, and turns mortals into immortals. Within ancient Chinese alchemy, you have the elixir of life and these practices called like Neidan and Weidan, which are like psycho-spiritual pursuits for people to not only cure their physical ailments, but gain insight about the nature of the world from them. And so that is a common theme. I'm going to touch on in the next slide a little bit about alchemy. But you also have Ayurveda, that's ancient Indian. I wouldn't call that alchemy, that's like a holistic medicine practice that just uses the Indian worldview that is just kind of abstract from us, but it includes things like a spirit and a soul, and it's these energies in the world that are a little bit more, I don't want to say simplistic, but like metaphorical in nature and psychological in nature than they are material. And so that's been probably one of the oldest plant medicine, practices it's like over 5,000 years old. But then of course you got the Abrahamic religions, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is how the Bible opens. And then in Revelations at the end, it closes with the tree of life. And so there's a lot of debate about what the apple was, about what's going on with the tree of life and the river of life. There's been some modern, interpretations on the Abrahamic traditions, and especially upon the Apocrypha, which is books that simply weren't included in the official Bibles or the official Abrahamic stories. They make up hundreds, probably thousands of literature that goes beyond the canonized version. And a good book is called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, which argues that Jesus was actually a mushroom, the Amanita muscaria, which is him in a relic up there on the top right. Those are believed to be Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and there are a load of those types of paintings in Eastern Orthodox Russian Christian churches and temples and stuff. So he makes the argument that when Constantine, who was considered the father of Christianity, was compiling all these religious texts together, that all the local tribes were taking their native and indigenous knowledge and then encrypting them into these biblical metaphors so that they could preserve their knowledge of how to make plant medicines, how to heal themselves, how to how to make medicines, heal themselves, and they wanted to preserve all their information, but they were being killed for trying to propagate it. So they were pagans, and so John Allegra is a linguist, and he just breaks down all these different words and stuff and explains that really it's a nature-based religion which has been concealed in this in the Constantine, like, New Age biblical Jesus tradition. So that's something that's really worth looking into. It's a fascinating story. Then a little bit further forward in time, you've got Western European alchemy, which is made up of the likes of like Paracelsus. They call him the father of medicine, the father of pharmacology and toxicology. He's the dude who invented the antidote and said that the cure comes from the poison. He made a bunch of major contributions to modern medicine, science, and chemistry, which we still use today, and we're still like learning from today. And the alchemists were like looking for, again, this philosopher's stone, this universal medicine, this kind of idea that you can take one thing that'll solve all your problems, which we kind of still have today in our Western world. We all want to get like a single pill and like it'll fix everything that's wrong with us. I feel like that's a vein of thought that runs back much longer than just the advent of pharmaceutical medicine. But it's very, very interesting and intricate. I see it as like the Western world's mythologies. Like the Greeks had like Hermes and Asclepius, and the Egyptians had these grand, like the Book of the Dead and all this stuff. They had these great mythologies that depict how their culture got there and what they're doing and their purpose. And we in the Western world have kind of been cut off from that for various purposes, and it's definitely an underlooked aspect of our story, I think, considering that really science comes from Western alchemy, medicine comes from Western alchemy, chemistry, alchemy was considered proto-chemistry, so they have a lot of recipes doing various things with plants to enhance their longevity, to maintain their youth, spiritual enlightenment, if there is such a thing. On the right are some alchemical depictions. They kind of did the same thing that the guy in the sacred mushroom and the cross is talking about. They put their understanding of nature into these encrypted drawings which try to describe natural processes as a means of making new tinctures, new salves, all sorts of different like technically applicable things that you would use in your everyday life. And Paracelsus would invent all sorts of crazy stuff and test it on like chickens that don't have any more feathers, and all of a sudden they're like growing all their feathers, they're laying eggs again. He's got all these different stories that go in on this stuff he made, which is overlooked, I think, in our common world. And that's not something that's unique to just Europe either. Like alchemy is a kind of a broad term to apply towards many different worldwide traditions, like the Tibetans, the Taoists, there's Chinese alchemy, there's Indian alchemy as well, which is kind of tangential with Ayurveda. And so in my studies, I've seen that alchemy is the longest standing plant medicine tradition that has arisen across disparate cultures. Like they're disconnected cultures which don't communicate to each other, but this same kind of practice of using plants to achieve like a knowledge about the world and physical health, which have all risen together. So I see that as like an inspiration for how we should look at plants and plant medicine, because they can certainly help us with our physical health, and they can certainly teach us things about the world depending on what we're using and how we're using it. There's psychoactive effects of a lot of stuff, and there's physiological effects of a lot of stuff. It's a very broad, like plants do everything. It's hard to wrap your hands around the whole thing. But basically, that's what naturopathy is. It's natural medicine from nature, where plants are the main source of active, I don't want to say ingredients, but they're the main variable in health and wellness and mindfulness, you could say. And we get to a point which is slightly after the silencing of European alchemists. There was definitely a major effort to kind of get rid of these dudes who are talking about taboo, woo-woo nonsense and spirits and souls that you can't actually measure or put on a scale and weigh or capture in a flask, and put into something that is more empirical. And so a lot of things were happening in the early 1900s, the late 1800s. Basically, we were isolating compounds for the very first time. and we were learning that you could synthesize them from crude oil. And so John D. Rockefeller created the International Health Division, which was kind of a precursor to the WHO, to the World Health Organization. But he basically, that we knew that you could make drugs from oil, but it wasn't being done in mass. The pharmaceutical industry was kind of nascent, it was just being developed. And so what he did was create campaigns, basically. You could argue they were propagandist campaigns, you could argue that they were just educational in nature, but just the fact that we could essentially take active ingredients out of natural sources and isolate them completely so that there is nothing else, there's no extra fuzz, it's just this single isolate, this chemical drug that is responsible for any bioactivities or effects within the body. And so he's really the one who coined the term allopathic medicine. And I kind of see that as like us that's where we kind of eliminated and cut off our umbilical to the naturopathic way, to what we used to know about all these plants and how we've been kind of working with them for a long time, because up until then doctors were like freely allowed to prescribe them to people and make teas and give people recipes. Caden's got a question.
Not only were they actively doing that, but wasn't it kind of quite a big push up until like the 1910s, 1920s? Like it kind of, doctors and everything everywhere were sticking very natural, and then this happened and it kind of forcefully flipped it all.
Yes, and there's a big financial motive because of that, because you can't patent these plant-based compounds or these plant-based remedies. You can't patent a plant. You can't patent a tea per se. But with the invention of individual drugs, active constituents, it gave them the ability to standardize it and to make it regularly like the same thing over and over and over again. So it was a major play on, saying these things aren't safe, we don't really know what's going on in them, we need to study them until we've completely taken them apart to be able to, before we're able to give them to people, basically. And so that's like where the financial industry became so heavily involved with the pharmaceutical industry, because of the ability to standardize them, really. And so they needed to patent them so the industry could remain regulated, profitable. And so we moved away from even just taking compounds out of plants where they're naturally synthesized. Like plants are the master chemists of nature. They are the master synthesizers. Likewise, so is our body. We can produce all sorts of things that we can't synthesize in a lab as of yet, but now we're taking them straight out of the oil and putting them through these refining processes to reshape these carbon chains, crude oil chains, and turn them into whatever we want, basically. And so that's really useful when you're making something that's not a crazy heavy concentration. It'd be different if you're like making like a car or something. You're not going to fabricate everything out of crude oil. Obviously, it runs on crude oil. That's a different kind of story. But you're only using like a couple milligrams of a very particular compound in a drug. And so that really took the world by storm, especially once it started going, because the International Health Division only lived for like 20 years or something before it merged into like a conglomerate of federal organizations. So as an example of the difference between allopathy and naturopathy, we have, this is salicylic acid, which comes from white willow. It's a very common example because it's super easy to see. It's not easy to see. The lines are blurred. It's not black and white, but it's super easy to see here what's really going on. Because we've got this drug on the left, which is salicylic acid. It's naturally produced by willow trees all around here. Because it's produced in nature, you cannot patent it. And so it was needed for them to put their basically pharmaceutical signature on it, which is what this is right here. It's called an acetyl group.
It's basically a chemical structure that allows certain kinds of drugs to bypass the blood-brain barrier much more effectively. And so what it did was allow a more rapid ingestion or a more rapid effect onset. However, when they were looking at it to begin with, they were looking at the difference between just the salicylic acid, the naturally derived version versus the artificially derived version, and they found that it doesn't really change the quality of the medicinal effects themselves. And in fact, there was a higher incidence of side effects in the acetylated artificial version of the natural drug. And so it's kind of drawing a line. It's kind of showing that, like, when we meddle in nature's creations, we don't really have the wisdom necessary to make like something perfect. And I shouldn't say the salicylic acid is perfect either, but we know also that the willow bark itself, so that previous study was just these two isolates being studied, where in this one they're looking at a tea of the willow bark and leaves itself, and they found that the amount of the quote active ingredient salicin, which is the same as salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is a metabolite of salicin. So same, a little bit different. It's just what your body does to absorb it. They found that the amount of salicin that was present in the willow bark could not explain the therapeutic effects delivered from the tea, and so that there must have been other contributors at play. And that kind of introduces us to a new topic as well, which is synergy, which is basically the idea that plants are complex mixtures of chemicals, which, when isolated from each other, they may not have the same effect as they would if they were present together. And so that's empirically, evidentially expressed here in white willow, because you need these polyphenols and flavonoids, other classes of molecules, working in conjunction with the salicylic acid in order to get the same level of therapeutic effect that the aspirin would give you. So that synergy is something that's present in a lot of different natural medicines. So in a sense, you can't really get a natural medicine from a pharmaceutical drug, because overwhelmingly they are individual drugs. They're not going to be, they're what they call polypharmacy in the industry, is the use of multiple drugs together to achieve an effect, but it's not something that's typically done because it's just too complicated for pharmacologists basically to standardize and figure out how it's even working. And so what they do, so in nature we find this like kind of all over the place. We can't really get, you can't get the same effect of aspirin as you can from willow bark with minimal side effects to still achieve anti-inflammatory effects in your body. Same with kava kava, cannabis, Bacopa monnieri, also known as Brahmi or Gotu kola, depending on where you're from. Kava kava is a really interesting one. It's got these two compounds in it which have an interaction together, which allows them to become bioactive and give them their sleep-inducing, sleep-enhancing qualities. Without those compounds together, both kavalactones and glutathione, which you could say are the two active ingredients, alone are toxic. So it'd be hard to make a medicine out of kavalactones, is what I'm saying. Similarly with cannabis, they've shown that the subjective experience is mediated by the smell. And what that means is that the terpenoid profile, the aroma of the cannabis, has a significant impact on how you experience the subjective effects of cannabis, the psychoactive effects. And so if you eliminate all the terpenoids from cannabis, which could be like hundreds of different compounds, it could be a dozen different compounds, it really depends, then it's not going to have the same quality as a what they're calling full spectrum medicines would. Same with Brahmi, and it's got nicotine and bacosides in it. Bacosides are terpenoids, which they like increase the rate of communication between new neurons, and nicotine promotes neurogenesis, and so obviously you can promote neurogenesis like completely naturally with the power of thought, but with nicotine and bacosides, you can use that synergy between the two to achieve a better cognitive enhancing effect, which is what it's been used for since like, it's named Brahmi after Brahman, this Hindu god. It's been used for like thousands of years as basically a meditative supplement, as a cognitive enhancer for Brahmin priestcrafts, and nowadays we're using it for like ADD and ADHD to help focus. But on the flip side of things, so like these are all medicinal plants with medicinal compounds, and the list goes on. That's just a small example. And again, we have another small collection, a small example of toxic plants with medicinal compounds. So allopathy can be good. I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other. I do have some leanings, but like these are all incredibly toxic plants. On the bottom you have monkshood, which that active ingredient there in the top right, aconitine, is incredibly poisonous, and it's considered the most toxic plant in Europe. And they use it to like poison arrowheads and shoot people with arrows and sedate them, and it's been used in accidental poisoning, cases of suicide, and it has very, very minimal use in the pharmaceutical industry. They're exploring its uses, but it's not really a drug that they're actively pursuing with too much fervor. Same with sweet clover and yew tree and foxglove, datura, Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, which grows all around here. It's got atropine and scopolamine. If you take any of these plants and you make a tea out of them, you're going to have a really bad time. That's not to say you can't use what's in them medicinally, but like with datura, it leads to raging hallucinations, convulsions. It really messes with your heart. And like my teacher said one time, she's like, there's a really, really fine line between convulsing in the hospital for 4 days and like having a psychedelic experience. And at the end of the day, I heard the psychedelic experiences from those aren't like the most sought after. But you can use these compounds in medicine for the most part. Aconitine, not so much, but so these plants are basically considered toxic, but you can get medicinal compounds from them through the allopathic way of making medicine, basically. So, like,
poke your head up
please
there,
ask
just
me
for
something.
clarity. The warfarin, the
Yeah.
sweet clover,
Yeah,
that like the same as sweet clover that's found around here.
yeah.
That's a new one to me because I've also read about like the consumption of sweet clover.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, kind of, to what
There
level
are-
you know, otherwise I'm gonna dig a little.
I wouldn't eat it directly. Like, it only takes a very little bit to become sick with them, and there are traditional recipes really for all of these things to be used medicinally, but it's not, I wouldn't consider them medicinal plants in the sense that they're readily, it's not something that you could just like do safely without like specialty knowledge. Is how I see it. Because there's this old axiom.
If I could say something about the sweet clover, I'm in a plant chemistry class right now.
Cool.
My teacher is, like pretty well known around the nation. She said sweet clover by itself you could use in a tea or whatever. There are reasons that you use it as an herbalist, and it should be fine.
And how do you know if that was leaf or flower?
The aerial parts, so anything
So
leaf or flower. But however, she said one of the problems with sweet clover is, and humans don't do this on their own, it's mold. If you get a sweet clover that has any mold on it, it changes to dicoumarol, which it will cause you to bleed to death. The problem with it is, I mean, I'm sure it's based on the dose, but the problem that they had was that that's how they started investigating this plant, and they made dicumarol with it, and they couldn't regulate when to get the body to start working again with the vitamin K so that it wouldn't bleed to death. So sweet clover grows around here. It's a great plant. It has coumarins in it. It does not have Coumadin, or the drug that you take, but you can use it successfully as long as you don't get any moldy parts. There was a problem with livestock because it would get moldy. They'd cut the hay and then it would get moldy.
Yeah.
So that was what we studied that today. So that's why I'm saying.
Yeah. That was great information. Thank you for that. Yes, totally. Like, oftentimes the plants will do something like with sweet clover, it can lead to hemorrhaging, but sometimes you might need, it's also used as an anticoagulant. So you can use that property in a way which isn't commonly used to get a medicinal effect from it. So a lot of plants are like that. And I feel like that comes back to what, the father of medicine, Paracelsus, used to say, was that it's not in, he said it about alcohol. It's like alcohol can be medicine, nourishment, or poison. It all depends on the dosage. And the same thing with poisons. You can get the antidote from the poison. Same thing with viruses. You get vaccines from the viruses. So it's all about, really, the preparation is everything. But that's a great contribution. Thank you for sharing that. So again, it's like, do your own research as a conclusion here. It's not black and white, but it is true that the majority of drugs are made from nature. They're either directly from nature or inspired by nature. And so we have a repository of useful tools available at our hands. We just simply don't have, we lack the application, the ability to apply them correctly without the knowledge. So that's kind of why I'm here, is to explain how that works. So my kind of theory is basically that humanity is the climax. That's humans down here. We're the climax of all the evolutive processes. This is eukaryote, one of the 3 domains of life. All this stuff that happened before humans, is a precursor to humans. And so we'll find a lot of things that are in humans, chemically speaking, distributed throughout the rest of the plant and animal kingdom, in the bacterial and the archaea kingdom, or domains. And so it's like there's serotonin in pineapples. Serotonin is the chief neurotransmitter in the human body. There's melatonin in black pepper. Dimethyltryptamine, they say, is produced everywhere throughout the plant kingdom. GABA is the chief neuroinhibitory compound that's in passion flower. So these are all neurotransmitters that are found in plants that can be used by us if we just basically, we can put them in teas or take them through various different means, but they work for us because that they can add to our own chemical imbalances, and if we can use them correctly, we can get a very natural healing effect from them, because oftentimes there is just chemical imbalances which need to be addressed. But again, in other instances, like there's accidental discoveries, sometimes stuff just works and we don't know why, but we find that we can benefit from it. So there's no really clear path to this is how medicine is made, this is how drugs are invented, or how plants are used. It's just kind of like we don't really know what the world is, and we're kind of just discovering things as we go. Only 15% of plants have been discovered. There's thousands of compounds in every plant. It's like an endless rabbit hole that we're diving through, that we're trying to keep putting together as we learn more about it. So, yeah, the medicines are discovered. The way they're discovered varies greatly across time. So that's kind of like how medicines come from plants and what the difference is between them and pharmaceutical drugs. And so if we want to take a look at plants and how they're constituted, I think that helps paint a broader, more understandable picture of what's really going on. Because basically, you can bifurcate it into two really simple categories. That is primary metabolites. I'll just call them chemicals because I can call it a bunch of different things. Primary, essential, or fundamental chemicals is one category. In the other category, you have secondary, non-essential, or specialized chemicals. Now, primary chemicals, fundamental chemicals, are things that an organism cannot produce on its own. It must get it from the environment. That includes things like amino acids, minerals, carbohydrates, vitamins, certain vitamins. Some you can produce, some you can't. Same with amino acids, but for the most part, you need to get certain fuels from the environment so that your body can produce the things it needs to produce, hormones, neurotransmitters, etc., etc. And what those are these specialized chemicals, these secondary, quote, non-essential compounds, which are produced within the organism. They are not involved in the normal growth and development, where they're used in, plants and humans have both of these, so it's kind of hard to make a distinction because we've got nervous system, we've got a lot more stuff going on. Plants usually have like one chief specialized chemical in them. So in pepper, it's like piperine. In brahmi, it's the bacosides. In passion flower, it's the GABA. Like there's usually the plant will, in cannabis THC, a plant will basically make one compound and then many different variations and subtle differentiations on that prime motif. And so that is what makes up the secondary specialized chemicals. That is the uniqueness of the plant. And that is like kind of what describes the chemical speciation, if you will. It's just the uniqueness of the plant. But the primary, essential, fundamental chemicals, they are directly involved in the growth and development and reproduction. And again, you must get them from the environment. So we need to get them from the environment. Plants need to get them from the environment. It's really important to know because basically primary minerals, primary elements, primary metabolites are combined together to create the secondary specialized metabolites. And so both in naturopathy and allopathy have we been using these specialized secondary compounds to treat disease and regulate health and discover new applications of medicine. Whereas dietitians, like some naturopathic doctors and nutritionists, will primarily employ the primary metabolites. So that's like your minerals, your amino acids, your carbohydrates, the things you need to get from the environment. And there is Dr. Linus Pauling, who's a very famous chemist. He's like 2-time Nobel Prize winner. Some people say he like invented the field of biochemistry. That's an arguable point. I would say he made major contributions for sure. But he wrote this book, How to Live Longer and Feel Better, which basically expounds the primary fundamental chemicals as the basis of health. He developed this form of therapy called orthomolecular therapy, which is a play on chemical words, ortho meaning right. You need the right molecules and the right amounts in order to maintain your body's homeostasis, because your body wants to heal itself. It wants to stay in homeostasis. It naturally does this, but it's only when these fuels, which are the fundamental compounds, come out of balance and they're no longer available, can we not produce the things that's needed for our baseline experience of life. And so he's a guy who's like popular he made vitamin C popular. Like the reason we take vitamin C is because Pauling like made it known that we have to put these primary fuels, these fundamental compounds into our diet. And so I really think that is where, the Hippocratic axiom comes for let the food be your medicine, because everything has these fundamental compounds. We face some challenges in the West because we are lacking nutrients in the soil And then in the grocery industrial complex, like the way industrial agriculture has been going for a while, we've been kind of killing the soil life and the soil vitality and leaving the soil absent of many of these primary metabolites. And so industrial ag comes in and floods the soils with these artificial nutrients, which aren't quite the same as what is naturally present there. And so because the food grows out of that soil, we get nutrient deficient foods. And because we're eating those foods, we are also then nutrient deficient. I would argue it's probably the greatest threat to Western civilized society is maintaining a wealthy, balanced diet, because that sets the baseline for your quality of life, your cognitive functioning, basically everything. So it's essential. We call them primary, and I call them essential because they are absolutely essential for your physical and your mental well-being. Again, I think I have on the next slide. Well, basically, like I said, the primary compounds, they make the secondary specialized compounds. So if you can consume primary compounds, you're going to be much more apt to have regular levels of all the different necessary life components within your body. Same goes for plants, but we're basically a plant. I think that's all I have on
I
this.
think that's just it, though. That's the argument that's always made through nutrition, is getting the right fats, getting the right amino acids, getting the right amount of proteins and everything, especially in your 20s, and then again later on in your life in your like 70s and 80s, it becomes so picky at those moments because of cognitive function, because of immunofunction, like cardiovascular function. Like without all of those primary compounds, your body can't
It
produce what it needs to.
deteriorates in all sorts of different ways. Neurologically, yeah, horrible ways. Like, it's really the foundation of health is proper nutrition. And we seem to have known that for a very long time and drifted away from that understanding because I think of the advent of pharmaceutical drugs, really, because we're just fascinated with all these specialty novelty compounds which can treat any symptom that you have. But that's why I think it's like treating the symptom or treating the source. Like the secondary specialized compounds treat symptoms and primary fundamental compounds treat the source. And so
I think you and I have talked about this before, but it just feels like a worthwhile comment to guys. But just in
Say it.
regards, I guess, to like the consumption of those things, like a lot of people forget how much specifically our brain uses of everything that we consume. It often seems to everyone thinks it's the body, the physical exertion of energy and everything else, but it tends to be here, and then when function is lost here,
yeah,
it just goes to the rest.
Yeah,
It's
there's-
just, like further support to the macronutrients.
yeah, there's a lot to say about energy being depleted just from thinking too much. Like, we burn calories just by thinking about stuff, and yeah, there's so much going on within the body that we really need to have we need to have this understanding, because it's just ridiculous to me that they don't really teach you that in school. They like make the primary, secondary differentiation and explain the synthesis of all these things in the plants, but it's like if that's like a more of a holistic approach to life that just is like somehow left out of our culture, left out of our upbringing, unless you got like lucky with really good parents, I guess, or something. But yeah, so amino acids are like a major player within those primary compounds. Most of, if not all of the specialized metabolites, the specialized compounds, are different arrangements, different configurations of amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of nature. They're the language of nature. And so if you can supply yourself with these amino acids, which that's the basic structure of them, the R group just is it's the variant, it's what makes them all different. But that structure right there, it has nitrogen, which is an essential macronutrient for us. but with all these different, I think I have a picture of them up here. Did I not include one? Well, you should look them up. But basically, these essential ones on the right are what your body cannot produce, and the non-essential ones on the left are what your body can produce. That being said, you can still get all of these from the environment because it does take energy to make and synthesize these things within yourself when you can equally as easily get it from your diet. So that's what I really hope that y'all take away from this at the very least, is that these primary building blocks, these primary nutrients are really where it all begins. And it's only until after you have a problem that you need to go to these specialized metabolites. But that is also a really cool thing because, again, there are a finite number of primary metabolites. There are practically an infinite number of specialized metabolites. I like to think that for every complaint, there is a plant or at least a drug for it. This is curcumin from turmeric, which has a multitude of different applications, from skin to eye to cancer, inflammatory conditions. It's considered a cure-all to many different cultures, which is a misnomer a little bit because nothing's a cure-all, but one thing can have so many different applications that we can definitely find from nature, if not now, in the very near future. As we're discovering 65,000 compounds a year, we're gonna discover new medicines. We're going to find new solutions to all these novel problems that our world is creating for us.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
You were back on, when you were on amino acids. In your school, did you study much about glycine and glycine substitutions?
What do you mean glycine substitutions?
Well, there's one researcher from MIT who believes that Roundup causes a different form of glycine that has the wrong shape, So, but that your body will substitute it, thinks that it is the real glycine. And so when it's building your body, it grabs the glyphosate glycine instead, or the glyphosate instead, and inserts it, which makes faulty proteins, like wherever you're making proteins. And I just wondered if you studied that in school or not.
Not like in depth like that. They basically made us memorize the structures of all of them and their names and stuff and what compounds that they can create. But they explain like how that happens. Like, the only reason any of these specialized compounds work is because we have receptors for them in our cells distributed throughout our body. And you can take a random example. You could take like curcumin here, which it escapes me what receptor it binds to, but you can just make a single alteration to it, and that can have a completely different pharmacological effect. And that's something they taught us about. Like, they drove the point home. I forget the name of this medicine, but they basically developed this medicine that was for nursing mothers. I forget exactly what it did. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I forget the name of it. I forget exactly what it did, but it was this medicine for nursing mothers, and basically they had one conformation, which is like, say my hand is a molecule. They had this left-facing molecule, and then they had like an enantiomer, which is like a mirrored version of that molecule. It's just oriented different in space, and so they bind to the receptors in a slightly different way. It's like practically the same exact thing, but it like caused all sorts of deformities in DES.
I think it was DES, diethylstilbestrol.
That sounds right to me. Yeah, and it's like there's so much that can come from like just a simple atomic, like one atom being changed or rearranged in position, or being shaped a little bit differently. That's one of the hardest things I think probably about medicine, is because you basically have to test every single little thing on everything, and there are unlimited permutations that you can make from like even a simple amino acid, for sure.
I just wondered if you studied it, because not everybody believes the theory, but it's a major theory that is out there for people to stop using Roundup.
Yeah. Yeah, they've made it illegal, I think, in Europe to use glyphosate, and there's definitely a lot of studies that have shown that it's not good for the body. There's a litany of bad things that come from it to us and to the environment. But yeah, that's the reason why that happens. Our body can be easily tricked, and that's the reason why allopathic medicines work, is because they mimic all these natural processes, and it's just a matter of like figuring out what they do through experimental means that is blocking us from really understanding what they're doing. And so if somebody's making an agricultural amendment or an herbicide or pesticide, they might not test it on humans before they release it into nature. And so then you have this artificial alien compound, and there are many of them out there in the world now that are jacking up our physiology, our homeostasis, that messing up the ecology of the environment. So yeah, that's why that works. We didn't study it in depth though, not glycine example for itself. I want to say one thing about just learning about all these different plants, which is hard to kind of like express how many different plants there are in the world, but it seems like from all the different traditions that have been around that there is a written record of, and from all the different plants, just like I brought an encyclopedia of plant medicine back there, it seems like so many of them are geared towards reproduction and the feminine, like fertility and maternity, like childbearing. It seems like there are so many that are just strictly set, not strictly, but used principally for, I would just say, the feminine experience in reproduction in general. Because, well, I mean, that makes sense to me, because that's basically evolution's main goal, is to fertilize and reproduce. And I've always thought that, like, we should know more about that, because we don't really have that much education on, like, just these sorts of things, these plants that can help us. It's a shame, but yeah.
At a time too where everything's just all over the place. I mean, just in that example, we know fertility rates are down all over the place, especially in this country. So to be able to utilize plants that can benefit that and improve that, like, just as one simple example, like, the importance behind understanding and properly utilizing plant medicines is
Knowing like what the general application is for them. I think that's what nature's trying to do, is like preserve itself and carry itself forward into the future, and it does that through production. And so I think like nature produces a lot of plants that just happen to have that effect within humans, and probably within animals too, that essentially nurture and protect this reproductive system, both in men and women. But there's a lot to say about like in Africa, there's this, they call it the Tsar cult. I don't know what the traditional names for it are, but it's just all about like making sure the right spirits go into the right child, and it's all about like bringing the child into the world safely and all this postpartum care. It just blows my mind that it's like this huge plant medicine tradition is just really about childbirth, that it just gets, I feel like that a large part of that gets overlooked in our culture. So I figured I'd just throw that in there. It's a little off topic, but basically the key is tea. It's not that difficult. They say in the biochemistry textbook, you open it up, the first chapter says water is the universal solvent. And so that means just a solvent is something that can take on the properties of of another organism, or of another plant, or of another piece of matter, I guess you could say, that it can dissolve its properties within itself. And so you can't, in a lot of instances, you can't really eat plants. You might not be able to digest them. A lot of mushrooms are like that. But water, making tea, boiling it is a very powerful extractor that you can use, that is something that you should use regularly if you want to experience the symptomatic relief of various different plants. So that's just very generally speaking, like definitely exceptions to that rule, because that's not always the rule. Like with kava kava, you need alcohol and water, and if you need to go beyond like teas, then I definitely recommend doing a little bit more research. But you can find a lot of good information just from a book, or as we're going to see from Google Scholars, you can get much more technical information. It's hard to just go out and know what to get and how to prepare it. These scientists have literally done all the work for us. They've analyzed these plants completely, their active constituents, what the traditional preparations were. They replicate them exactly. They test them on humans. They're not perfect, but nobody's perfect. Scientists definitely not perfect, but Google Scholars is an incredible repository for finding plant medicine information, and you can really just go in there and type a disease and a keyword plant medicine, and you can get a long laundry list of data that is up to date, that is it's not the easiest to understand, but they've got like instructions basically so that you can repeat it. It might be a little technical, but I encourage you to familiarize yourself with Google Scholars, because it is an invaluable resource for sure, especially now in the age of information. 20 years ago, it'd be much more difficult. A little bit of bonus content: shamanism and consciousness. It wouldn't be a plant medicine presentation without the shamanism and consciousness. So definitely psychedelic drugs have been used to treat mental health for a very long time. They can treat traumas. They can treat, they say that like one psilocybin dose is equivalent to 10,000 hours of cognitive behavioral therapy. A heroic dose of psilocybin, which is like a couple, like 8 grams or something. 7 and up grams. So it's a very large dose, but they kind of are this one time take it, much better off for a very long time afterwards. Here is just like depicted the amount of connections that your brain makes with other regions of your brain. Placebo is just normal. That's under psilocybin, which is psychedelic mushrooms, as I'm sure you all know. And we have one of the most recent definitions of a psychedelic, which is drugs that have the capacity to reliably induce or compel states of altered perception, thought, and feeling that are not or cannot be experienced otherwise, except in dreams or at times of religious exaltation. And I put that in red because we do have dreams regularly. I'm not so much a religious person, but I am pretty fascinated with what's going on in there. However, I feel like there's more to be said about dreams and psychedelic drugs. This is Dr. David Nichols, who's considered one of the godfathers of psychedelic therapy. He's a pharmacologist. He's got like over 250 different publications on the structure of psychedelic drugs and how they're related to the effects we experience. He is probably the leading researcher in the field. He's definitely a pioneer, and he's been doing it for like 40 years or something. He thinks, so I've always just wondered, like, yeah, psychedelics are great, and they can show us a lot of stuff about ourselves, and they can heal our traumas and stuff, and I just always struggled with how to really use them to their fullest potential. And Nichols says that he is a big proponent of using them to help elderly people prepare for their death and to basically calm their anxieties. I think that's a great thing to do. It's still kind of like becoming standardized, and like when is the best time to use them versus when might not be the best time to use them. But he thinks that is probably what his number one recommendation is to all of his patients. And there are other people that use it in psychiatry and stuff to release trauma. like with PTSD and such. So there's a lot of different entheogenic plants, though, that have different effects, and trying to understand, like, again, like wrap my arms around the whole big picture of psychoactive substances basically is very difficult to do, but I feel like I have come to a understanding of the different world's traditions and common themes that are present across cultures which don't communicate but have come to the same conclusions. And this is 1-irigens, which I think is kind of the bridge between, you know, just anti-anxiety medications and then psychedelics, which could be heavily intense for some people. 1-irigens is a plant that stimulates dreaming consciousness. 1-irology is the study of dreams. And we have across many, many different cultures throughout history and that are alive today, which use plants which stimulate the dreaming mind to achieve a multitude of different things, from like ancestral communication to therapeutic experiences to even this guy on the right is from the Zulu tribe in Africa, which has this practice called ubulawu, which they have over 300 different 1-irogenic plants that they use to consume in ceremony and ritual so that they can actually hunt more plants, if I can put it like that. They will go into a dream state and then find new plant. They'll get information from the dream where they can go hunt out new plants, and they'll be told how to use them and how to prepare them in their dreams. And I don't know how much truth there is to that. They seem to be still alive and kicking, so they have been led astray too much. However, I just think it's really interesting how we have this definition of psychedelics, which basically says that you can have a psychedelic-like experience in your dreams. And then we have across the world all these different plants and all these different cultures which are specifically using these plants for similar purposes, which is to have these transcendent experiences, gaining non-local information, communicating with ancestors and spirits and things of this nature. I mean, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, they had sleep temples. Sometimes they called them dream incubation. They were often like dedicated to Asclepius and Imhotep in Egypt, and they had like sleep doctors that would come in, give them preparations so that they could have this visionary experience while they're asleep, and then they'd come out and they'd interpret it for them and with them, and they'd help them come to terms with whatever kind of healing they set out to go in there for, which I always thought was just absolutely fascinating and mind-bending, because it's just, I don't know how I even stumbled across this topic, but it's like something I think that is kind of a missing key in understanding the psychedelic uses and potential applications of psychedelic experiences. So that's actually all I have for you today.
So I have a question about how did you pronounce that last name?
1-irigen.
Yes. So are they found throughout different plant species, or is that one specific plant?
Many different plant species, many different genera. Yeah, there's a lot of them. I referenced this 300 different 1-irogenic plants here with just the Zulu tribe. I think they're in like South Africa and a little bit above South Africa. And it's a wide variety of species. But there are some that grow around here. There's some that grow in South America. There's some that are all over the Pacific, the islands out there, the Pacific Islands. They're kind of everywhere. So.
I've never heard of them before, so I'm
Yeah. Is there any other thoughts, concerns? That's kind of all I got for you. I really appreciate y'all sticking it out and hearing me out. Girl in the back. Yes, it's jdsfarmacopia.com. And like that's my Instagram and Facebook, and I post everything I'm thinking about there. All my vlogs, and I'm on YouTube. Yeah.
Highly suggest following him. He goes
Nick-
off on some.
Nick has a ton of great information on his website.
Yeah.
So definitely check it out.
Thank you very much. I don't feel like I'm that great at putting together presentations. Like I said, I'm just trying to tell you everything I know all at once, and it probably was a little bit disorganized, but I really appreciate you guys hearing me out. For sure.
Go ahead. Oh, I thought you
Oh,
were
no,
about to say
I was talking, I said very interesting,
No.
sorry.
I guess I just wanted to add like 2 points that I think were like when you were touching on tea and then when you were touching on psilocybin a little bit, that 2 things from my brain just on the topic as I do. One with tea is really important. I'm a tea fanatic. I have so many jars at home full of roots and loose leaves and everything else. A very important thing for people to know when consuming tea, it's actually a tradition. I think it's Chinese tradition, probably Japanese to be honest. But you usually pour out the first pour because a lot of your tannins, a lot of the bitters come out in that first steep. And it's not good for the body to be taking in a whole bunch of tannins all the time. So when you make a nice pot of tea, the first pour, the first steep, like let it steep for a couple minutes nice and hot and pour that off and then re-steep. Because you'll get less of it, you'll still get all the beneficial compounds you need because it doesn't all wash out in 2 minutes from the plant. But most of those tannins leach out right in the beginning. So you can pour off a lot of the tannins and remove some of the bitterness. A lot of people do that with green and black teas.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know if you wanted to add on to that or not.
Everywhere and stuff like that. I think it's a shorter time that you wash tea, but
It might be even like 30 seconds.
They-
Yeah, it's pretty
5 to
quick.
10
Like, I don't let it sit long and then I dump it off.
Yeah, these scientists will do that. They'll take like green tea or black tea, they'll take different herbs and like measure exactly how long you need to let it steep to get the highest concentration and the widest spectrum of compounds in the tea. So yeah, it's definitely like an art that
Most teas,
Need
if
to be
you go
perfected.
over 2 or 3 minutes, I think you start to increase chemical or compounds that you don't want.
yeah, green
And
tea.
they actually get, green tea can get carcinogenic if you let it steep
Yeah.
too long.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second comment was in regards to psilocybin when you were talking about synergistic effects of like primary and secondary compounds and everything else. Just in a world where psilocybin and psychedelics are becoming way more active, one of the really like fascinating topics to me when I was digging into psychedelics a couple years ago was specifically about psilocybin, and there's a lot of push for medicinal psilocybin in the future and yada yada, and how since it can't be patented as a natural compound, they have to make their own lab grade
Yeah,
psilocybin.
they make pills.
And at that, what they miss is all these secondary compounds that are present, like beta-cysteine, origination. I know there's a bunch more. Those are the 2 that I'm most familiar with that have specifically, I believe beta-cysteine and origination are known to be beneficial with psilocybin's effects in psychedelic-assisted
Mhm.
therapy. So all of a sudden you get rid of those compounds and it doesn't have the same effect, whether that's because of how it lasts, because of how, what it does with the wiring in the brain, but just
Yeah.
tagging on to the synergistic compounds earlier, like as we move into a world that's starting to accept and open arms to a lot of these compounds, it's also important for people to understand, like, just because the best company in the world is selling it to you out of their
Yeah.
lab doesn't mean it's actually the best medicine for you to get.
Yeah. 100%. They call that the matrix effect when you have all these different variables at play that make a different effect than any one of them possibly could. And it's like, that's what I was trying to get at in that one slide with the synergy, is that is a major contributor towards many different medicines. I could make a list that just goes on forever. There's one on my website. All the different synergies.
would you say
Right.
that what effect was the matrix effect?
The matrix effect, they call it polypharmacy. The entourage effect, which is what the cannabis industry uses. Yeah. That's all I got. You're free to go. Thank you for coming.
Any other?
Any more questions? Yeah.
Another questions?
I'm here to talk if you want to say.
Yeah, we've got the room till 8 o'clock, So if anyone wanted to stick around and poke Nick's mind, if he wants to, feel free. One, thank you, Nick. I'm getting better, but still learning the intro, outro for these events when we host them. So in the beginning, I kind of just forget. Like, Audrey's here. Audrey is the secretary and been a huge supportive member for Spirit Healing Initiative as we've been growing slowly over the years, and I just don't want to leave her hanging off to the side. Nick has been an extraordinary friend of mine for the last couple of years, and I'm like, as Joe said, if you haven't spent time talking with him, he's only in town for a few more days, and but obviously through his website and through Instagram and there's other methods to be able to reach out and talk with him. But there's such a plethora of topics you can run through his brain, and he will bounce for hours with you on it. So I was just really excited to be able to sit and listen for a little while, and happy to have had him here today. In regards to Superior Healing Initiative, we do have an Instagram. We don't have an operating website right now, but we have an Instagram page, a Facebook. Pretty active through both of those for future mindful moments. Trying to get one of these going every month. December we will not be hosting one just because too much with all the holiday fuss and everything to try and squeeze that in there, but looking like in January and February we've already got some soft plans going on. Joe, I'm going to talk to you actually.
Saw that coming.
But keep an eye on our Instagram page is definitely the most active way to find out about events. I should have brought our email list. I didn't even think of that to be able to get some emails. But if you are curious, you can come pass me your email and I'll get it saved on a note so I can put it out in that as well. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming out tonight, supporting Nick.
Thank you very
a little
much.
bit of support that brings to Shy. So if we could just one little round of applause for Nick. And otherwise, yeah, you are all free to go, but if you want to stick around and poke my brain, poke Nick's brain, poke anyone else's brain in here that you're curious to talk to, feel free. We've got the room till 8. So.
I'm Josh.
That was awesome. It was such like a conglomeration of like so many parts of how I met you. it was like oh yeah, talking about this.
Nothing you have
Just in like a synthetic way. Can I please have the slides so I can read all the text because I didn't bother to read it while you were talking.
Yeah, I'll send you the one with all the notes on it too. That one have it
Like the speaker notes.
See you tomorrow? I got a lot of questions.
But I think the funniest thing you said was, I'm not super religious myself. that was unexpected.
Yeah, I didn't mean to go into so much on this.
Yeah.
I'll interject with some buzz gun. You guys keep talking. The back here.
Yeah.
BBS.
BBQS, that sounds like it's good illustrated.
But I did econ tacos.
David said something about it, but I don't know if it was after or before. I don't know when. When did you do it? Maybe that's the same.
Where are they doing it? Where are people like really choose to?
Yeah, it's just
A couple different schools. I don't know if they're like they're not accredited, but they have actual membership. There's one in Maine last year in Colorado. They're just teaching people membership about and have classes on like natural medicine.
nice getting much related.
They're visually accredited schools. Literally accredited.
Who doesn't credit some of this?
who does it for work.
It's just
I don't know, it's
interesting
like
thought
a
to eat.
conspiracy of all schools that put together. You're not a student. And we're gonna allow you guys to get on the
Dude, this is the thing, you make cooking sound like mad science.
I'm in the same program. I just started out.
just started out like,
Well, like I'm getting through Chem 11 and then into Chem 12. Then I have a general idea of what's going on. But no, I attempted to talk. It had to be like last year around this time.
Everybody was just like,
a month ago. Dr. Hillhouse. He had done research, I guess, in, I don't know if it was Madison, it might have been Madison, Wisconsin, where he was doing ketamine, psilocybin,
jumping topics real
tests.
quick. I forgot to send you that email I said I'd send you about
His personal problem with it.
now it's like no rush, obviously, because like I
kind
said,
of
we're
en
gonna
masse.
take December.
And I just want to
And
iterate
like
on it. Just,
January,
it wasn't really
Ruben
practical
had
for a
some guy
therapist
for
to
some, like,
to
health
give
tech.
someone that, because it's like an 8-hour, 10-hour thing.
So I'm gonna
And
try.
but I talked to Dr.
December,
Cruz,
partner up with Innovate
and
and do one.
he,
with him there.
his background in it, he said,
And then-
yes, it is and
I
isn't.
can't
He said,
remember
well, what if you had
Justin,
effectively a
does that
clinic
sound
where it's
familiar?
only that you're working on? Like your job as the pharmacist is to do that for 8 to 10 hours every day with one patient. I don't know, you're just thoughts.
I mean, I think it could
I have
work.
notes somewhere with
It
all
could
of
work,
them.
like, with proper preparation.
So
With
there's
ketamine,
this
ketamine's
chronic
crazy.
Well, not that specifically, but just
syndrome?
generally,
See, I-
psychedelic experiences and
Basically what it is,
psychopharmacology.
I still have to dig more, but there is this
If you got a good clinic, I mean.
inflammatory issue that I think this guy himself was struggling with. And there isn't really much known about it, yada yada. There isn't a good way to detect it, or test for it,
You
something
should
like that.
just
But he
take
came up with
somebody's
a
degree.
some sort of piece of technology or application or like some. I still gotta learn more. That's right. I don't know much of it. He came up with something that's supposed to be beneficial and supportive to
Good with
this
people
disease.
itself, just to,
And he's kind of running
just to accept that,
company that
and like, go into some
I
potentially.
think if you were to type it in on
life-changing
Instagram, it's like
experience,
CIS.
do a sketch, but I think it's definitely possible, like.
It's like on the tip of my tongue, and I
Because
looked
that's
it
how
up
it's done,
recently,
like,
so I
in
don't know
past,
where.
there's shamans, there's
Let's see.
people that, there's always somebody that guides the experience is an experiment.
But we're gonna
There's
try
always
and
somebody
get
that guides
him
it,
going
right? It's
through
like
Yeah.
gurus and shamans and
January. I'd like to try and work with you guys in February. Am I gonna?
Yeah,
And
possible.
do you think
It's
you'd
just, like,
rather,
makes it
depending on what I figure out with
Yeah.
Innovate,
Yeah.
if there's something we're doing over
go
there
through
for
the
Justin,
system
would you rather do
to
it
get to
there and
that
keep it a
point.
little more niche to the Innovate
with the
community?
amount of people
Or
we
because
get
you
to,
guys
Yeah.
are already pretty in there, would you
there'd
rather
definitely
do
be
somewhere
like a
like
different
here?
kind of thing.
Yeah, it's just,
Interesting to see how
Okay,
it all-
that's just good
those
to take.
molecules you're talking about, right? It's semi-artificial,
Yeah.
which,
Yeah.
we're gonna talk, so.
Yeah, I mean, like my greatest plant medicine experience was tripping on mushrooms for the first time. My friend Ryan is
See,
in the middle of the neighborhood, like 10 at night, and they're completely unhindered, no
Yeah.
limitations. So like that was
Chronic
one of the greatest like learning experiences through my stuff.
Search. Wait, okay, I'm
Yeah.
getting closer
It could
now.
be-
It's closer. CIRS.
Could be like artificial if it's it's all contextual based. Like that's one thing Nicholas talked about, and he spoke at the school like 3 semesters ago or something. And he was like, the opportunity for somebody to have a profound healing experience is entirely dependent on the setting of psychedelics. Like just because you take a psychedelic doesn't mean you're gonna have a great healing experience or a religious or mystical experience or something. It's totally dependent on the setting. I'd be freaked out if I was a doctor. Like, and laugh at
The
shit. Not around nature.
like night and day of like being up and like alert and like maybe like going on a walk on mushrooms versus like laying down and just like turning
But-
everything off
Yeah.
is like it's so something.
Well, especially we got Jonas and Nick at the factory.
Jonas.
Regulation makes it difficult, for sure.
Mhm.
Regulate that thing attaching to the nature of reality. So, no
how do you introduce it to society safely and healthily, where you're not going to get either side of it, right? You're not going to get the use of
And adults here in Canada had phones, blindfold,
free
sat
for
up
everyone, where it's
in the middle of
unregulated,
the
but also
episode,
so
I
regulated
really
to the
talking
point where
to
it's
you.
not amazing. It's just curiosity.
But that was still
It's
like
like
at a point in
Romanology,
time when I was
like,
kind of
we're
more
kinda like-
interested and intrigued
we'll get
by the like
Yeah.
joy and
Step by
fun
step.
that it
Anyway, I gotta get straight for
Just-
Winston, so it's good to see you,
And now
Carlos, and it's good to hear you speak.
Thank you for coming out.
Yeah.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah, take it easy, and I'll see you around the
like
co-op and
control of what's going on.
Yeah.
And not even control, like the ability
yeah,
to
yeah.
control my ability
Yeah,
to
keep
let
it
go.
going. Yeah, keep me posted.